We meet her at 37 years old, sitting alone on the splintered steps of a boarding house with a single carpetbag beside her, having just been told that she no longer had a room, a husband, or a name anyone in that town cared to remember kindly. The man who put her there was her late husband's business partner, a land agent named Silas Drummond, who had spent 2 years quietly rewriting the terms of every joint account and every shared claim until, upon her husband's sudden death, there was nothing left in her name at all, only papers, signed months before, that Drummond swore she had witnessed herself. She had $11 to her name, folded twice inside her glove. And when she heard that an abandoned railroad spur running out of a dying town called Ferrow's Junction was being sold off for its scrap rail at $3 a mile of right-of-way, she bought the deed to the whole forgotten line without asking why no one else wanted it. Everyone told her the tracks led nowhere, that the line had been quietly struck from every county map 20 years before, and that walking it alone for 3 days into open country, as she intended, was the surest way for a woman to vanish the way the town at the end of it had already vanished. They did not know that something waited at the terminus of that line which had been deliberately buried from memory, a truth someone had worked very hard to make sure no one would ever walk far enough to find. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Cassandra Hale, if you have ever followed a path everyone told you led nowhere, and found it led somewhere that mattered. Tell us about it in the comments. We always want to hear how you found your way. Cassandra Hale had not been born to a life that prepared her for boarding house steps and $11 folded into a glove. She had come into the world in 1849 in a modest farmhouse outside Council Grove, Kansas, the only daughter of a surveyor named Ezra Hale, a meticulous, weather-beaten man who spent his working life walking the plains with a transit and a chain, measuring out the invisible lines that would someday become fences, roads, and rail beds across a country that did not yet know its own shape. Ezra brought his daughter with him on short surveys from the time she was old enough to hold a stake steady, and it was from him that Cassandra learned to read land the way other people read faces, to notice where a creek had once run before it changed course, where a stand of cottonwoods marked water even in a dry season, where a section corner had been moved and why. Her mother, Willa, had died bringing Cassandra's younger brother into the world, a brother who did not survive the same week, and so it had been father and daughter alone for most of Cassandra's growing years, bound together by long days on horseback and longer evenings spent by lamplight while Ezra taught her to read a plat map, the way Scripture is taught to the devout, with patience and repetition and the unshakable conviction that the truth was always there in the lines if you were willing to look carefully enough. It was, Cassandra would later say, the only inheritance her father ever truly had to leave her, and it proved in the end to be worth far more than any of the money that was taken from her. She married at 26, later than most women of her country and station, to a railroad man named Thaddeus Hale, no relation by blood, a coincidence of surnames that had amused them both. When they first met at a surveying camp where Thaddeus worked as a construction engineer for a modest short line railroad company pushing westward through Kansas and into the edges of Colorado territory, Thaddeus was a careful, ambitious man, not grasping but hopeful, the kind who believed that a rail line built honestly and run fairly could bring genuine prosperity to towns that had nothing else to recommend them. And he and Cassandra spent the first years of their marriage following his work from camp to camp, she keeping his survey notes and correspondence with the same exacting hand her father had taught her. Until in 1874, Thaddeus was made a junior partner in a new venture, a spur line to be built out from the main trunk toward a proposed depot town. The company's investors had already begun calling Ferrow's Junction, named for the primary financier behind the scheme, a wealthy and rarely seen man named Augustus Ferrow. Thaddeus believed in that spur line the way he believed in very few things in his life. certain that it would bring rail service, and with it genuine prosperity, to a stretch of prairie that otherwise had no particular reason for anyone to settle it, and Cassandra, who had grown up watching her father draw lines across empty land and call them into being, believed in it too. What neither of them understood, not fully, not until it was too late to matter, was that Silas Drummond, the man who managed the spur line's local accounts and land acquisitions on behalf of Augustus Ferrow's investment group, had been quietly building an entirely different kind of fortune underneath the honest one Thaddeus believed they were building together. Drummond had spent 2 years acquiring, at deliberately depressed prices, land along the spur's proposed route from homesteaders who did not know that the railroad's own surveys that Thaddeus himself had helped draft, never suspecting how they would later be used, marked their parcels as sitting squarely atop rich seams of coal that the company had no intention of ever telling them about. When Thaddeus died suddenly in the winter of 1876, thrown from a handcar during an inspection of track that should never have failed the way it did, Cassandra told herself it was a terrible accident, the kind that happened often enough on rough frontier rail work that no one thought to ask harder questions. She did not learn until many months later, when she went looking for the joint accounts she and Thaddeus had always shared, that Drummond had already begun, weeks before her husband's death, filing paperwork that quietly transferred controlling interest in their modest joint investments into accounts bearing only his own name. Paperwork that carried what appeared to be her signature on lines she had never in her life put a pen to. She had no proof it was forgery beyond her own certainty, no lawyer willing to take on Ferrow's money on behalf of a widow with no funds to pay one, and no family of her own left to stand behind her. Within a year of Thaddeus's death, she had lost the small house they'd shared in Ferrow's Junction, the last of their savings to legal costs she could not win. And finally, that autumn, her room at the boarding house itself, when the landlady informed her, not unkindly but firmly, that a woman with no income and no prospects could not be carried on credit indefinitely. It was in the weeks after that, wandering the edges of a town that had once felt like a future and now felt only like a place she was waiting to be asked to leave, that Cassandra first heard the talk about the old spur. Ferrow's Junction, it turned out, was not the only depot town the company had built along its westward ambitions. There had been another, further out, called Amity Ford, established 3 years before Cassandra and Thaddeus had even arrived, meant to serve as the terminus of a longer branch line pushing toward a stretch of country rich, or so the original surveys had promised, with coal and good grazing both. Amity Ford had thrived, briefly, boasting nearly 400 residents, a depot, a church, and a schoolhouse, before it simply stopped appearing on company maps sometime around 1871, and stopped, not long after, appearing on county maps at all. The old-timers who remembered it spoke of it the way people speak of something faintly embarrassing, a town that had failed, that had been abandoned when the coal didn't pan out, and the spur line that had once run 31 miles out to serve it had been quietly stricken from the company's active roster, its rails left to rust, its right-of-way sold off in a forgotten transaction to a scrap dealer who had, evidently, never bothered to send anyone out to actually collect the iron. It was this scrap dealer's grandson, a tired, indifferent man named Purcell, who ran a hardware store out of the front room of his house, who was selling off the deed to that right-of-way for $3 a mile. $31 in total, simply to be rid of a piece of paper he considered worthless. Asterisk. Cassandra bought that deed with $9 of her $11, and she would tell you, if you asked her honestly, that she did not fully know why. Perhaps it was only that a piece of land, however worthless, however abandoned, was still more than she owned in any other direction. Perhaps it was her father's old habit surfacing in her, the instinct that a survey line, once drawn, meant something real regardless of what anyone chose to say about it later, and that a town simply did not vanish from every map in the county without someone having gone to considerable trouble to erase it. She remembered, too, something Thaddeus had mentioned once. In an offhand way she had not thought about in years until that very week. A remark he'd made about the Amity Ford branch surveys, about how strange it was that the company's final report on the coal seams out that way had reversed itself so completely from the original assessment his own crew had filed, calling worthless a deposit that his own numbers and his own instruments had shown to be extraordinarily rich. He had laughed it off at the time as simple bad luck, the kind of thing that happened often enough in speculative country. And she had not thought of it again until she stood in Purcell's cluttered store with the deed in her hand and felt, for the first time in a year, something that was not quite hope but was at least its close and patient cousin, curiosity. She set out from Ferrow's Junction on foot 2 days later in early October of 1877, with what remained of her $11, a bedroll, a canteen, a small store of hardtack and dried meat, and her father's old brass compass, which she had kept through every loss of that terrible year, because it was the one thing that had never once, in her whole life, told her a lie. The tracks themselves were easy enough to follow at first. Rust-red rails still bolted to ties gone silver and cracked with 20 years of prairie weather, running dead straight through country that grew wilder and more solitary with every mile. The tall grass grown up thick between the rails so that walking them felt at times like walking through a tunnel of gold-green stalks with only a narrow silver seam of iron to mark the way. She walked 12, sometimes 14 miles a day, sleeping at night in the lee of old telegraph poles that still stood, though the wire long since gone, and on the evening of the first day, resting where a small culvert crossed beneath the grade, she found the first sign that this had once been more than a speculative failure, quietly written off, a child's tin whistle, half buried in the silt at the culvert's mouth, the kind of small, ordinary object that suggested not a town that had slowly emptied as its residents drifted off to better prospects, but a town that had been left, in some fashion, in more haste than that dot by the second day. The signs multiplied in ways that unsettled her more than she let herself admit, even in the privacy of her own thoughts. She passed what had clearly once been a section house, its roof long collapsed, and inside it, protected from the worst of the weather by the fallen timbers above, she found a ledger swollen with damp, its pages fused in places, but legible enough in others, belonging to a track foreman named Cyrus Deal, recording, in a plain, unhurried hand, routine maintenance entries for the Amity Ford branch through the spring of 1871. Entries that continued, in the same steady hand, right up until an entry dated the 11th of June that year, after which the ledger simply stopped mid-page, with no explanation and no further entries at all, as though Cyrus Deal had set down his pen in the middle of an ordinary working day and never returned to pick it up again. She spent that second night in the ruin of the section house with the ledger in her lap, her father's compass beside her, and she found that she could not stop turning over the strangeness of it. A town that had allegedly failed slowly, from disappointing coal assays and dwindling interest, did not usually leave behind a foreman's ledger abandoned mid-sentence, its final entry giving no hint at all that anything unusual was expected that day. She reached Amity Ford itself on the afternoon of the third day, coming upon it not gradually, the way a traveler expects to approach a town, but suddenly, as the tracks crested a low rise and the whole abandoned settlement lay spread below her in the flat, golden light of late afternoon, a depot building with its roof half fallen in, a scattering of false-fronted stores along a single wide street gone to weeds, a small white-steepled church leaning at an angle that suggested its foundation had shifted badly over the years, and beyond it all, a schoolhouse standing curiously intact, as though the prairie itself had chosen to spare that one building out of some old and private courtesy. What struck Cassandra most, standing there with the wind moving through grass grown waist-high in what had once been the town's main thoroughfare, was the silence of it, not the ordinary quiet of empty country, but a stillness that felt to her deliberately preserved, as though the town had been sealed away from time itself rather than simply left to it. She walked its single street slowly, reading what remained of the painted signs above each door: a mercantile, a barber, an assay office. Its windows still lettered though the glass itself was long gone, and she understood, before she had even reached the depot at the street's far end, that Amity Ford had not failed the way failing towns usually fail, unraveling thread by thread as families drifted off one by one toward better prospects elsewhere. It had stopped all at once, the way a clock stops when its spring breaks, and whatever had broken it, she began to suspect, had broken it deliberately. The depot building held the answer, though it took her the better part of that evening and into the following morning to find it in full. The station agent's office sat behind the ticket window, and there, in a small iron safe left standing open, its door not forced but simply left ajar, as though whoever had last stood before it had been in too great a hurry to close it properly, Cassandra found a strong box of company correspondence that told a story entirely different from the one recorded in Ferrow's Junction's official histories. The letters, exchanged between Augustus Ferrow himself and a company geologist named Bertram Kessie, revealed that the original coal assays for the land surrounding Amity Ford, the very assays Thaddeus's survey crew had helped establish, the ones that had drawn Ferrow's investment in the first place, had in fact proven true. The seam every bit as rich as first reported, but that Ferrow had discovered in the spring of 1871 that a substantial portion of the richest ground lay not on land the railroad had properly purchased, but on parcels still legally held under treaty rights belonging to a band of Caw families who had never fully relinquished claim to that stretch of country. Families whose continued presence Ferrow considered an intolerable obstacle to the fortune he intended to extract from beneath their feet. Rather than negotiate or wait for the slow machinery of federal land policy to resolve the question in his favor, Ferrow had instead ordered the geological reports quietly falsified, declared the seam exhausted and the branch line a failure, and arranged for the town's few remaining residents and the Caw families both to be pressured off the land within a matter of weeks, using a combination of withheld wages, manufactured safety concerns about the mine works, and, in at least one letter that made Cassandra's hands go cold as she read it, the deliberate sabotage of a rail culvert timed to coincide with a supply train, an act meant only to frighten and disrupt, but which had, by Kessie's own careful and guilty account, resulted in the deaths of 4 men, among them the very foreman, Cyrus Deal, whose ledger had stopped mid-entry 2 days' walk back down the line, killed. The letter stated plainly, in an accident that had never officially happened, in a town that had never officially existed at all, because Augustus Ferrow had found it cheaper and cleaner to erase Amity Ford from every map in the territory than to answer for what he had done to build his fortune upon it. Cassandra sat with those letters until the light through the depot's broken windows had gone from gold to gray to nearly dark, and she understood with the same clarity her father had once brought to a poorly surveyed section line exactly what she was holding, not merely proof of an old crime, though it was certainly that, but proof that the coal beneath Amity Ford and beneath the parcels Silas Drummond had spent 2 years quietly acquiring from homesteaders back near Ferrow's Junction, on the mistaken belief that the seam ran only that far and no farther, extended out here as well, onto land whose rightful ownership had never actually been settled, land that, properly surveyed, might still belong in substantial part to the Caw families who had been driven from it, and to the handful of Amity Ford residents whose own homestead claims she now saw clearly, had never been legally extinguished at all. Only abandoned under duress and left to molder in a company, safe that no one had ever expected a lone widow to walk 3 days to find. Asterisk. She walked back to Ferrow's Junction slower than she had come, carrying the strong box's contents wrapped carefully in oilcloth against her chest, the whole 31 miles. And when she arrived, 4 days after she had left, she went first not to Silas Drummond, whom she suspected would move quickly and ruthlessly to bury what she'd found the moment he learned of it, but to the one man in the county she believed still owed her husband's memory an honest hearing, a federal land office examiner named Walter Poe, recently posted to the district, a careful and somewhat friendless man who had already, she'd heard through boarding house gossip, begun quietly questioning certain of Ferrow's older land transactions on his own initiative. Poe read Kessie's letters twice through without speaking, and when he finally looked up at her, his expression was that of a man who has just been handed the missing piece of a puzzle he had been assembling alone and in the dark for longer than anyone knew. What followed was not swift, and it was not without cost to Cassandra, who found herself, in the weeks after bringing the Amity Ford letters forward, the target of exactly the kind of quiet pressure that had once emptied that town in the first place. Silas Drummond, informed within days that a federal examiner had begun asking pointed questions about old branch line surveys, moved first to discredit her, spreading word through Ferrow's Junction that the widow Hawley had gone strange out there alone on the abandoned tracks, that grief and isolation had unbalanced her mind, that whatever papers she claimed to have found were more likely the product of a desperate woman's imagination than any genuine company record. It was a familiar tactic, she came to understand, the same one that had been used against her a year before when she'd questioned the forged transfer of her and Thaddeus's joint accounts. And this time, as before, she had no money for a lawyer and no standing in the town's eyes beyond what little goodwill remained from her husband's memory. Drummond went further still, quietly warning the boarding house landlady and the handful of merchants who had continued extending her small credit that association with a woman under such a cloud might not reflect well on their own standing with the company. A pressure Cassandra felt in the sudden coolness of doors that had, until then, remained at least cautiously open to her. What turned the balance, in the end, was not any single dramatic confrontation, but the patient, unglamorous work of meeting paper, the same work her father had spent his whole life teaching her to trust. Walter Poe, moving carefully and without tipping his hand to Drummond or to Ferrow's distant investors, spent the following 2 months quietly cross-referencing the falsified geological reports Cassandra had brought him against the original survey notes Thaddeus Hale had filed with the company years before, notes Cassandra herself still possessed, carefully preserved among the few personal effects Drummond's maneuvering had not managed to seize, precisely because they had seemed, until now, worthless. The numbers matched Kessie's guilty letters exactly, and matched too the testimony Poe was eventually able to gather from 2 of the surviving Kaw elders who had been driven from land near Amity Ford and who had never stopped, in all the years since, quietly pressing their own claim through whatever slow federal channels remained open to them, a claim that had been repeatedly and mysteriously delayed at the district level in ways that now, with Kessie's letters in hand, looked considerably less like bureaucratic accident and considerably more like Augustus, Ferrow's money working exactly as it had been meant to work. When Poe formally reopened the federal inquiry into the Ford land transfers that winter, citing both the recovered company correspondence and Thaddeus Hale's original survey data as corroborating evidence, Silas Drummond's careful arrangement of falsified transfers back in Ferrow's Junction came under scrutiny as well. The 2 schemes proving, as such schemes often do, to be built from the very same dishonest timber. The resolution, when it finally came the following spring, Restored to Cassandra not a fortune, though there was eventually a fair settlement of the joint accounts Drummond had stolen from her. Paid out under federal order once his forgeries were formally established. But something she had come to value rather more highly during her long walk out and back along that abandoned line: a clear and public accounting of the truth. The Federal Land Office voided the fraudulent transfers surrounding both Amity Ford and the coal parcels near Ferrow's Junction, restoring legal title to the Caw families, whose treaty rights had never actually lapsed, and to the handful of Amity Ford homesteaders, or their surviving heirs, whose claims had been extinguished only on paper and only through coercion. Augustus Ferrow, who had built his fortune and his considerable reputation on the story of an honest speculative failure, found that story permanently and publicly unraveled. His continued involvement in any federal rail contract, quietly but firmly discouraged by an investigating office no longer inclined to overlook his methods. And while no court in that territory in 1878 was prepared to charge a man of his standing with the deaths at Amity Ford directly, the loss of his contracts and his credibility proved, in its own slow and unglamorous way, to be a reckoning he could not simply write his way out of. Silas Drummond fared little better. Stripped of the accounts he had stolen and unable to explain the forged signatures, Poe's investigation laid bare beside genuine samples of Cassandra's own hand. He left Ferrow's Junction before the spring thaw. His name from then on a thing spoken in that town, the way Amity Ford itself had once been spoken of, quietly, and with the particular embarrassment reserved for failures everyone had, for too long, simply agreed not to look at too closely. Cassandra did not use what remained of the recovered coal rights to build herself any great fortune, though the settlement would have allowed it. Instead, working alongside Walter Poe and two of the Caw elders, a woman named Louisa Redwing Sky and her brother Thomas, she helped establish a cooperative mining arrangement over the restored parcels. Its earnings divided fairly among the Caw families and the returning descendants of Amity Ford's original homesteaders, with a portion set aside, at Cassandra's own quiet insistence, to rebuild the little schoolhouse that had somehow survived 20 years of prairie weather, standing empty and alone, not as a monument to what had been done there, but as a promise that whatever the town became next would be built honestly, on ground whose true history no one would ever again be permitted to erase from the map. We began this story with a woman sitting alone on a boarding house's splintered steps, $11 folded into her glove, having just bought the deed to an abandoned rail line that everyone told her led nowhere at all. We told you she walked 3 days along tracks struck from every map in the county, and that what waited at the end of them had been deliberately, carefully buried by a man who found it cheaper to erase a town than to answer for what he'd done to it. It was never really the coal, in the end, valuable as it proved to be. It was the plain, patient truth her father had taught her to trust in every survey line he ever walked, that the land remembers what people would rather forget, and that a woman willing to keep walking, long after everyone else has turned back, will eventually arrive at exactly the place the truth has been waiting for her. Her name was Cassandra Hale, and she did not restore Amity Ford by claiming it for herself. She restored it by insisting, 3 days' walk from anyone who might have stopped her, that a town does not stop existing simply because someone powerful once decided it was more convenient that way. Thank you for walking this long road with us and with Cassandra tonight. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who has ever been told that the path they were following led nowhere. Before you go, we would love to know in the comments below, what is a time you kept going after everyone else told you to turn back, and found something worth the whole distance? We read every story you leave us, and we carry them with us longer than you might guess. Until next time, stay close, *.